example, at a very low level, I've got there's 300 million of these little modules that recognize patterns or can remember a pattern or can apply a pattern, but they're pattern processors, 300 million of them in the neocortex, and they're organized in a hierarchy. So for example, I'll have a few hundred that recognize a crossbar to a capital A. And they're organized in layers. And each layer is a higher level of abstraction. So the next layer will get that crossbar and some other topological features and might say, a capital A. It goes to a higher level that might say, the word apple. Information flows down too. If the apple recognizes, sees APPL, but has not seen an E, it figures, I think we're going to see an E because I've seen every other part of this pattern. It sends the signal down to all the E recognizers, say, I think an E is coming, be in the outlook for it. The E recognizers change their threshold. If they see some sloppy thing that usually it wouldn't think is an E, but it's expecting an E, it says good enough, and it says, yeah, we've seen an E. Go up another 5 levels, now you're at a pretty high level, and below that is a hierarchy that extends into the different senses, so it might see a certain fabric, smell a certain perfume, hear a certain voice, and say, my wife has entered the room. Go up another 10 levels, and now you're at a very abstract level, and a pattern recognizer might go, that was funny, that was witty, that was ironic, she's pretty. You might think that those pattern recognizers must be much more sophisticated. They're in the frontal cortex than the ones that recognize, the edges of objects or crossbars to a capital A. They're actually the same, and they're interchangeable. I talk about in the book how a region called B1, which usually recognizes these simple things like crossbar to a capital A, what happens to it in a congenitally blind person? It actually helps the frontal cortex deal with things like humor and irony, really at the opposite end of the extreme end of the continuum of sophistication of feature. This hierarchy of the neocortex, we create ourselves with our own thinking, and you can see that in a baby. They're laying down one conceptual level at a time. A newborn is dealing with very primitive shapes and sounds and so on. And my 2-year-old grandson already now has laid down several levels successfully and can start to deal with simple language. So humor, irony, these are at the top level of the neocortex. And it really was the frontal cortex that allowed us to do it, but not because the frontal cortex is more sophisticated. The frontal cortex is just a greater quantity of neocortex. Only mammals have a neocortex, and only humans have this big forehead that basically was an additional quantity of neocortex. If you look at other primates, they have a slanted brow. They don't have these big foreheads. And that additional quantity of neocortex was the enabling factor for us to invent language and art and science and technology and advertising, conferences and so on. No other animal species has done that. And we're going to expand it again, basically. We've already have some expansion of it, into the cloud by way of these devices. Okay, we have to interact with our fingers and eyes and ears and so on, but ultimately we'll have more direct connections. I would say most of the neocortex in the human world is still biological, but remember this non-biological intelligence is growing exponentially. Our biological intelligence is basically fixed, and 30 steps exponentially is a billion. If you double information technology every year, which is what we're doing, in 30 years this will be a billion times more powerful. And in fact, I made these predictions 30 years ago, and they've tracked very perfectly. So ultimately, we will expand our neocortex with a greater quantity. This time not biologically, but non-biologically, but it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. And remember what happened the last time we expanded our neocortex by developing these big foreheads. That was the enabling factor for art and science and all of human expression. And we're going to do it again. This greater quantity will basically enable us to take another qualitative leap. And we'll have funnier advertisements. We'll be more loving, sexier, create more forms of artistic expression. You can see that already. When I was growing up, there was classical music and pop music. That was it. Maybe jazz for a few people. Now there's hundreds of genres of music and of every other art form. And we see, 200 years ago, a few people could know all of science, and you know their names. And today, there are millions of scientists, and there are tens of thousands of fields of science, and nobody can know even a small portion of it. So human knowledge is growing exponentially as well. So, I mean, the net effect is we will become more creative, and things like wit is really at the top level of our neocortical hierarchy.
I want to just dwell on that a little bit, because I think again, one of the things that perhaps you could look to kind of creative industries and advertising in particular is a kind of hypersensitivity to culture, to a kind of shared cultural set of references, and looking for almost performing very rapid kind of pattern recognition and invention of new metaphors in that, which leads to witty adverts and sexy films and all of those sorts of things. How would a non-biological intelligence both assimilate and sort of recognize and contribute to culture?
Well, let me describe where we are in sort of natural language understanding, which is what I'm working on here at Google. And a good example actually comes from another company. You've heard of IBM's Watson, which played Jeopardy. Now, Jeopardy is not a narrow task. When IBM's Deep Blue won chess, people said, okay, but chess is a logic game. It's not really an example of the best of human intelligence, but language is really the epitome of human intelligence. And Jeopardy includes riddles and puns and jokes and metaphors. It's a pretty sophisticated game. For example, Watson got this query correct in the rhyme category: a long, tiresome speech delivered by a frothy pie topping. And Watson correctly responded, what is a meringue harangue? And Jennings and the other guy, the best two players in the world, didn't get that. And Watson got a higher score than the best two players put together. But what's not widely appreciated is that Watson actually got its knowledge not by being hand-coded with all these facts by the engineers, but just by reading Wikipedia and several other encyclopedias, 200 million pages of natural language documents. Now, it doesn't read those documents as well as you or I. It might read one document and conclude, oh, there's a 56% chance that Barack Obama is president of the United States. You might read that, and if you didn't happen to know that ahead of time, conclude there's a 98% chance. So you did a better job than Watson. So why is it that Watson, can defeat the best two players in Jeopardy? It's because it makes up for that by reading more pages, a lot more. It read, as I said, 200 million pages. Personally, I get stuck at 100 million pages. And it has a good Bayesian reasoning system to combine all those inferences. So it's doing a very impressive job at subhuman levels, but making up for that by going at the fantastic, web scale. So that's what we're working on here at Google. We want to enrich search and question answering by having the computers actually understand what they're reading. If you write a blog post, you've got something to say, and we want to actually pick up that meaning and be able to do a more intelligent job of the kind of services that Google provides by understanding the meaning of documents. As I said, irony, humor, these kinds of things are at the top of the hierarchy. I've been saying that by 2029, computers will understand human language at human levels and then be able to apply web scale to that, which will be even greater than it is today, exponentially. It will be probably 100,000 times greater. So that'll be very impressive. The state of the art today is that we can use these tools as, to help do the more routine aspects of our work. We can find the information we want. We can access, if we need to do an advertisement on, some particular figure in human history, we can find out all the information instantly about that person and get lots of different perspectives. So we have that tremendous access to information and knowledge. It's a great communicator. I said that the emergence of these early forms of email in the 1980s in the Soviet Union would wipe away the Soviet Union. People thought it was ridiculous, and a few teletype machines would destroy this mighty superpower, but that is what happened. We saw a great wave of democratization in the 1990s, and we see the impact of social networks today. And we have a blending now of world culture. The segregation of world cultures where people only really learned about a small group of people that shared their history and stories, and that anyone else was quite alien, led to lots of wars. People say, well, that's still true, but actually it's not. There's been a great reduction, actually, in violence in the world. If you read Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, there's been a reverse exponential in violence. The chance of being killed today is 500 times less than it was several centuries ago. And that's because, in large measure, the sort of democratization of information. So, those of you who are on the cutting edge of communication, and advertising is really trying to create a powerful emotional message in very effectively and efficiently, we have all the world's cultures now to draw upon, and people are now being exposed to all these traditions and stories, which makes communication that much more richer. Language is basically metaphor. Every word is a metaphor, and we communicate by metaphors, and we now have a lot of more stories to draw upon.
I think it's wonderful that the reality of artificial intelligence and indeed the stuff that's going on at Google is that scene that's in every science fiction film where the computer plugs into every television station and every book and every piece of culture and just sucks it down and becomes kind of converse it in culture that way. It's good to see kind of it playing out that way.
Well, the exciting thing is that this access to all the world's information and cultures and stories and databases is available to everyone. Every kid with a smartphone, and there's over 1 billion smartphones, there's 6 billion cell phones, there'll be 6 billion smartphones in a few years, has access and intelligent access to all of this information, and actually has the tools to change the world. A couple of kids in a dorm had this cool idea about reversing the links on the internet to create a bit of search engine. They did it on their notebook computers, then became very popular on the floor of their dormitory, and spread from there. You know it now as Google. Another kid with his notebook computer created Facebook. It was just a kid, a 14-year-old kid, who created a revolutionary new approach to diagnosing pancreatic cancer, which can really change the treatment of that disease. The tools of creative change are in everybody's hands, and we're now. It's not. These are not just in the hands of a few government intelligence agencies and huge corporations. It's very widely distributed.
Which leads us nicely back to the law of accelerated returns. We've got about 15 minutes left in our session, so I'd like to turn it over to the floor for questions, if I can adjust my eyes to actually see any of you. So does anybody have any questions for Ray? I think there are some microphones flying around. Anyone? Oh, there's one just, people have just stuck their hands up down here. So there's a gentleman here right in the front, and then there's one just behind.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Would you say that there's also an exponential increase in, we have access to all these cultures, but as we get more cultures and more influence from them, would you say there's an exponential increase in culture as well? So, like you said, 50 years ago there's only a few types of music, and now there's infinite, or not infinite, but an incredible amount of different types of music and classifications of music. Would you expect culture to follow the same thing and have it become equally as numerous and distinct?
Did you hear that, Ray?
Well, yeah, I did. It's a good question. To define specifically the law of accelerating returns, it's that the price, performance, and capacity of information technology, not every kind of technology, progresses exponentially. And certainly, communication technology is one example of that. I mean, if you look at it just technically, if you plot on a logarithmic scale the number of bits we move around wirelessly, a century ago that was Morse code over AM radio, now it's 4G networks. It's a very beautiful, smooth, exponential rise. It's now trillions of times greater. To translate that to cultural impact, it has some of the implications I talked about, where we now have access to all of these different traditions. It does lead to greater tolerance. People think that's ridiculous and say, don't you listen to the news and there's constant conflict and war. Actually, our knowledge of what's wrong with the world and of conflict is that much greater. If there's a battle in Damascus or Fallujah, we not only hear about it, we're there, we experience it. That might be painful, but it's actually a good thing because it leads us to try to address those problems. 100 years ago, there could be a battle in the next village, you wouldn't even hear about it. And another positive aspect, as I mentioned earlier, is we are exposed now to all of these different cultural traditions. I grew up in a Unitarian church where we actually spent 6 months studying each religion, spent 6 months in Judaism, 6 months in Buddhism, and so on. And the message was many paths to the truth. They're all talking about the same world, and they use different metaphors and different stories and to give us insight into the same reality. So now we have access to all of these different cultures and traditions, and then we can create new traditions. So some kids on the street corners of the Bronx created hip-hop music and dance that spread virally around the world. These were kids with actually leftover equipment. The funding had been cut for musical instruments in the New York City schools, so they adapted these old turntables and actually invented a musical instrument out of it. So you have this fantastic creativity that comes from all walks of life and every type of culture. And so it creates a very exciting potpourri of cultural opportunities. It's a great opportunity for people who are trying to communicate messages because you have all of these very resonant themes and ideas and musical types of music and so on to draw upon. And I am quite delighted actually watching commercials of how different types of music, different stories are utilized in, to create an effective message. I don't think you can plot that. Can you see me? Did I?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You. Okay. So I think that's fueled by this exponential growth in communication and in access to knowledge and information. The impact it has is quite unpredictable, but it does lead to increasing human knowledge. There are ways of measuring that, and we're doubling knowledge every year, and that is reflected in the plethora of every type of knowledge, whether it's science, art, music, and so on.
There's another question just at the front here. I don't know if you can reach.
Hey Ray, how you doing?
Good.
Great honor. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this emerging platform that's thought-based navigation or thought-based interaction. So the idea is you put on this funny headband and your EKG brain systems are measured in some way that allows some sort of interaction. Is that going anywhere, you think? Is that another interaction format that we're going to have to start designing for, you think?
I actually was involved in a project where we captured EEG with a kind of a headband and then extracted your alpha waves, and everybody's alpha rhythm is a little bit different, and it reflects sort of the deep meditative cycle of your brain. So we would detect that and then create music synchronized to it. And then you could actually watch someone's alpha wave, and as they were listening to music synchronized with their own alpha wave, their alpha waves would grow in amplitude. And you would experience, if you were doing that, you would experience it as a sort of deep meditative state. So it kind of induced a deep feeling of meditation. If you listen to the music hooked up to someone else, it wouldn't work. In fact, if you even listen to your own brain-generated music, but a recording, when you were not hooked up to the machine, it didn't work. But if you were hooked up to the machine and it had this sort of feedback, it was an amazing feeling. Technically, actually capturing EEG is very difficult because they're very, very faint. They're about 1,000 times fainter than your EKG from your heart. Your muscles give off electrical signals that are very powerful, and this EEG has to go through the brain, and the brain is not like the powerful muscle of the brain. It's like the powerful muscle of the heart. The brain is giving off a very faint signal. Some of these headgear that are sold don't really do a good job of capturing it. They're more like toys. We found you actually had to adhere it with a kind of adhesive. And in women, their hair would get in the way because you had to really kind of do it at the top of the head. And so men's bald spots were actually convenient for that. So there's some technical issues. Another issue is that the bandwidth of this kind of brain communication is very low. So this has been done with good EEG capture equipment with, for example, paralyzed individuals who can then communicate with the computer that way and, say, direct a cursor on a screen and then actually form language or control their environment. But it's a very slow process. The bandwidth is very, very slow. If you could actually go inside the brain, communicate directly with the neocortical signals, you could then have a very high bandwidth. So, I mean, consider the bandwidth of my talking now. It's 2-3 words a second. It's moderate speed. The eyes, visual images are billions of bits a second. The signals, using this kind of EEG equipment, it's really just maybe 10, 20 bits a minute. It's very, very slow. So that's a problem. Once we can actually go inside the brain, we could have even higher bandwidth than we have now with our visual and auditory communication. We could have very, very high-speed communication. When I have a thought in my brain, it is there in my brain as a data structure that's hierarchical. There's a certain hierarchy of these neocortical structures, and I want to translate that to your brain. So I want you to understand my idea. So we invented language, and language is hierarchical. So I can take my idea, translate it into a language structure that reflects the same hierarchy, and then you can understand the language, and then that idea will be transferred to your brain. Now, it's a very imperfect process. It's full of ambiguities, and language isn't perfect, and so on. We ultimately could do that directly from neocortex to neocortex without the intermediary of language. On the other hand, language is also quite delightful. We sometimes utilize that ambiguity for positive effect. That's where we get humor, for example, sometimes with clever use of language's ambiguity. So yes, this is a form of communication. It's been very valuable for people who are paralyzed, who have no other way of communicating. So even though it's very slow, it's a lot better than nothing. But it does suffer from that speed issue, and ultimately we'll go inside the brain and get much higher speed signals.
Okay, so we heard you were working on the Google One Thought purchase. Is that true?
We couldn't possibly comment. I'm getting some.
No comment on that.
I'm getting a signal from the side of the stage that we'll have to wrap it up there. But having covered the formation of the Grand Canyon, the birth of hip hop, direct brain interfaces, and that computers will be witty as you in about 30 years' time, I think we'll probably leave it there. Ray, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.